My own nephew, the boy I raised after his father died, used my trust to seize control of our century-old construction company, then tried to frame me for the catastrophic failure of his own shoddy work. My name is Caleb Blackwood, and I'm 68 years old. My hands don't look like they belong in this century. They're a roadmap of a life spent with wood, steel, and stone. They're scarred from slipped saws, calloused from hauling lumber, and permanently stained with the dust of 100 foundations poured and 1,000 roofs raised. They know the difference between a load-bearing wall and a partition just by the sound a hammer makes against it. For 50 of those years, I was the heart and soul of Blackwood & Sons Construction, a company my grandfather started in 1922 with a wheelbarrow, a set of inherited tools, and an unbreakable rule he hammered into my father, and my father hammered into me: you build it to last a lifetime, or you don't build it at all. We weren't the biggest firm in the state. We never chased the high-profile contracts for gleaming glass skyscrapers that scraped the clouds. We were builders of a different sort. We built the bones of our community in the rolling hills of central Pennsylvania. We built the county courthouse with its solid oak beams, the library where my own children learned to read, the high school where they graduated. We built the homes families would pass down through generations, the barns that would stand against a winter blizzard, and the old stone bridge over Catcher's Creek that still holds the weight of 100 freight trucks a day. The Blackwood name wasn't just a logo on a dusty Ford F-150, it was a guarantee. It meant the foundation was sound, the joints were true, and the roof wouldn't leak, not in 10 years, not in 50. It was a legacy of integrity, passed from my grandfather to my father, and then to me and my younger brother, Thomas. Thomas was the dreamer, the architect with a poet's soul. He could see a beautiful home where I only saw a muddy lot. I was the pragmatist, the builder who could turn his elegant lines on paper into solid, unyielding reality. We were a perfect team, two halves of a whole. Then, 20 years ago, a scaffolding collapse on a competitor's site, a result of rusted bolts and a rushed inspection, the very things our father taught us to despise, took him from us. It shattered our world. His wife, Sarah, faded over the next few years, succumbing to a grief so profound it stole the very life from her lungs. They left behind a 10-year-old son, Ethan. I didn't hesitate for a second. My wife, Eleanor, and I brought Ethan into our home. He wasn't a burden. He was the last, precious piece of my brother. I raised him alongside my own two daughters, Sarah and Emily. I taught him how to throw a baseball, how to bait a hook, and how to drive a stick shift. On weekends, he'd follow me to the job sites. I taught him how to use a hammer without smashing his thumb, how to read blueprints, how to feel the right consistency of mortar. I thought I was teaching him our business, our heritage. I now realize he was only studying its assets. He was smart, impossibly so, with a mind for numbers and systems that always felt like a foreign language to me. He got a full scholarship to Wharton. I was so proud, I told everyone at the lumberyard. When he came back 4 years later with his MBA, he was different. He wore sharp, tailored suits that never got dirty and carried a slim leather briefcase. He used words like synergy, optimization, and leveraging assets. He looked at our crew, men who'd worked for us for 30 years, and saw human resources and payroll liabilities. "Uncle Caleb," he'd say, gesturing at our fleet of well-maintained but aging trucks, "these are depreciating assets. We should be leasing, not owning. It frees up capital for strategic investment." He called our reputation brand equity and talked about monetizing our legacy. A part of me was wary, but a larger part was still the uncle who saw a 10-year-old boy who'd lost everything. I wanted to give him the world, to see him succeed beyond my wildest dreams. And he was brilliant. He digitized our accounting, streamlined our bidding process with complex software, and our profit margins tripled in 2 years. I made him Chief Operating Officer. I thought I was securing the company's future, handing the reins to the next generation. I didn't realize I was handing him the knife he would use to cut me out. The big move came 3 years ago. He sat me down in my office, his face a perfect performance of earnest concern. "We need to protect the company, Uncle Caleb," he said. "As a family partnership, we're too exposed. One bad lawsuit, and they could take everything, even your house. We need to restructure into an S-corporation." He presented it as a shield. He brought in a team of slick lawyers from Philadelphia who buried me in a mountain of paperwork. "This is just standard boilerplate," he said, flipping through pages of dense legalese. "It protects the family's assets. And this," he said, tapping a specific document, "is a standard power of attorney for business operations. It just lets me handle the day-to-day contract signings and regulatory filings. You're 65, you shouldn't have to leave the job site to sign a stack of papers every afternoon. It's for efficiency." I saw the son I'd raised, the boy whose college tuition I'd paid, and I signed. I trusted him. That was the foundational mistake, the hairline crack upon which my entire world would crumble. If you enjoy stories of cold-blooded, methodical revenge, where a master craftsman uses his old-world knowledge to dismantle a modern empire of lies, like this video and subscribe to the channel now. We have brand new, unreleased stories here every day, each one more intense than the last. The changes accelerated after that. Ethan created a new board of directors, appointing himself as chairman, his lawyer, and a financial advisor from an investment firm I'd never heard of. "It's a corporate formality to satisfy our lenders," he assured me. "You still hold the majority shares. Nothing really changes." But it all changed. He started taking meetings I wasn't invited to. He'd fly to New York for capital acquisition conferences. He began pushing for a new direction, away from our custom-built, high-quality projects and towards large-scale, prefabricated modular construction. High volume, high profit, and in my opinion, low quality. The final, fatal blow was delivered on a Tuesday morning in early 2023. He called an emergency board meeting at a sterile, rented conference room in a glass tower downtown, not our dusty office at the lumberyard. I walked in, and he was sitting at the head of a long, polished table, flanked by his two board members. He didn't look at me like his uncle. He looked at me like a problem to be managed. "Caleb," he began, the word stripped of all warmth, "the board has voted to approve a new strategic direction. We're moving into large-scale modular construction. To fund this transition, the board has accepted a significant equity investment from a private equity firm, Northern Ridge Capital." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "This investment has resulted in a necessary and substantial dilution of all existing shares. As part of the new corporate governance structure, the position of founder chairman will be dissolved. All executive decisions will now be centralized exclusively under the CEO myself." I felt the air leave my lungs. "Dilution of shares? What are you talking about, Ethan? I own 70% of this company." His lawyer, a man with a face like a clenched fist, slid a document across the table without a word. It was a new capitalization table. My 70% ownership stake, the legacy of my father and grandfather, had been diluted down to a powerless 15%. Ethan and his new investors now owned 85% of my company. The power of attorney I'd signed had given him the authority to approve the deal on behalf of the company. "On behalf of me. We appreciate your invaluable contributions to the company's history," Ethan said, the words sounding rehearsed and hollow, as if he were reading from a script. "And to that end, we're offering you a generous 5-year contract as a senior advisor. You'll have an office, a salary. You can be the face of our heritage. Share the old stories for our marketing. A mascot. A ghost in the machine he had built for my life's work." I looked at his face, searching for a flicker of the boy I knew, the child who cried when his father died. There was nothing. Just cold, hard, reptilian ambition. "You've stolen my company," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "My father's company. Your father's company." "I saved it," he shot back, his composure finally cracking, his voice rising. "You were running it into the ground with your outdated, sentimental nonsense. This is the real world, Caleb, not some fairy tale about craftsmanship. You build things with your hands. I build empires. You were a foundation. I'm the skyscraper." I stood up. I didn't shout. I didn't plead. I just looked at him, the man who was once my boy, and said, "Thomas would be so ashamed of you." I saw a flicker of something in his eyes then, not remorse but pure, unadulterated rage. I had found the one nerve he couldn't shield with his corporate armor. I walked out of that room, my footsteps echoing in the silent, soulless space, and I didn't look back. I drove home in a daze, sat down in my father's old leather chair in my study, and I didn't get angry. I got quiet. I'm a builder. When you're faced with a compromised structure, you don't start swinging a sledgehammer. You study the plans. You find the load-bearing walls. You identify the fatal flaw. And I knew Ethan, for all his MBA brilliance, had one. He was arrogant. He believed the old ways were worthless, and in that belief, he would leave a vulnerability he couldn't see. My revenge wouldn't be a wrecking ball. It would be a precise, calculated demolition. My mise en place for this project had three essential components. First, I hired Margaret Maggie O'Connell. She wasn't a slick corporate lawyer from the city. She was a third-generation local attorney whose grandfather had drawn up the original incorporation papers for Blackwood and Sons. Our families went back a century. She understood that this wasn't about money, it was about legacy. "Caleb," she said, her office smelling of old books and fresh coffee, "this is airtight and ugly. He used your trust as a weapon. But every contract has a seam. Every arrogant man leaves a tell. Let me start pulling on the threads." Second, I called Marcus "Mac" Riley. Mac was our foreman, a man whose hands were as gnarled as my own. He'd worked for Blackwood and Sons since he was 18. He could tell if a wall was plumb just by looking at it. Ethan had pushed him out unceremoniously 6 months prior, calling him resistant to innovation. Mac's loyalty wasn't to a logo, it was to the family and the quality we stood for. "He's a damn parasite, Caleb," Mac growled over the phone. "What do you need?" "I need eyes and ears, Mac," I said. "I need you to talk to the old crew, the ones Ethan kept on. I need to know everything about his new flagship project." Third, and most importantly, I went to the large fireproof safe in my study. I pulled out my grandfather's journals. They were 6 thick, leather-bound ledgers, filled with his elegant, spidery script. He wasn't just a builder, he was a student of the earth. For 50 years, he had documented the unique geological conditions of our entire region, the soil compositions, the water tables, the hidden pockets of unstable sedimentary rock. Our foundations were famous for never cracking because he knew the ground better than anyone. This knowledge was our real secret, our most valuable asset, passed down through generations. Ethan, with his spreadsheets and his focus on scalable, one-size-fits-all solutions, would see this as antiquated nonsense. And that would be his undoing. Ethan's big, flashy project was a 200-unit luxury condominium building called the Pinnacle Lofts, built on a piece of land on the north side of the river. I didn't need to check the journals. I knew that land. My father had refused a contract to build a warehouse there 30 years ago. I pulled out my grandfather's journal for the years 1930 to 1940. I found the entry, dated May 12, 1934. His handwriting was clear as day. Asterisk surveyed the North Riverbank parcel for the new mill. Ground is deceptive. Topsoil is solid, but 8 feet down is a deep bed of expansive clay. Unsuitable for heavy construction without deep-drilled piers to bedrock. A standard slab would crack before the first winter frost. Asterisk Mac confirmed my worst fears a few weeks later. He met me at a diner with a set of bootleg blueprints he'd gotten from a sympathetic draftsman on the crew. "It's worse than you think, Caleb," he said, his voice grim. "He's not drilling piers. He's using a standard post-tension slab-on-grade foundation. It's faster, cheaper by $500,000. But on that soil, it's a death sentence for the building. A ticking time bomb." He was cutting corners on the single most important part of the structure, the part no one would see until it was too late. He was building on a foundation of lies, both literally and figuratively. I had him. He just didn't know it yet. For the next 8 months, I became a ghost, meticulously gathering evidence. Mac was my covert agent. He fed me a steady stream of information. Photos taken with a burner phone showing insufficient rebar placement, spaced too far apart to provide adequate tensile strength. Delivery dockets for a cheaper concrete mix with a low PSI rating, a mix that would never withstand the stress of the shifting soil. Reports from the crew that they were pouring the foundation in sections, creating cold joints, weak points, to speed up the schedule. Ethan was building a monument to his own greed, and I was documenting every single flawed brick. I took this data to a renowned structural engineer, a semi-retired professor from Carnegie Mellon named Dr. Eris Thorne, under a strict non-disclosure agreement. I gave him my grandfather's geological surveys, the bootlegged blueprints, and Mac's illicitly gathered data. He built a complex predictive model. His conclusion, delivered in his precise academic tone, was chilling. "Mr. Blackwood," he told me, "this isn't a question of if this foundation will fail, but when and how catastrophically. The differential settlement in that expansive clay soil will put unimaginable stress on that inadequately designed slab. It will begin with hairline cracks in the first 12 to 18 months, then escalate to major structural fractures within 3 years. I wouldn't want to be in that building during a heavy rain season or a deep freeze. It is, in my professional opinion, a man-made disaster waiting to happen." I waited. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. I let him build his tower of lies almost to completion. I wanted him at the absolute peak, on the precipice of his triumph, before I pulled the ground out from under him. The Pinnacle Lofts was nearly finished. It was the talk of the town. Pre-sales were strong. Ethan was on the cover of a regional business magazine, arms crossed, smiling, hailed as a visionary who was revolutionizing the construction industry. The week before the ceremonial ribbon-cutting, I made my move. First, Maggie sent a registered letter to the CEO of Northern Ridge Capital. The letter was a formal notice of concern, outlining, in excruciatingly technical detail, the high probability of catastrophic structural failure at the Pinnacle Lofts. It cited my grandfather's historical soil surveys and the inadequate foundation design. It included Dr. Thorne's preliminary, unsigned, and deeply alarming report as an addendum. It was a warning shot across their bow. Second, 2 days later, an anonymous package was delivered to the lead investigative reporter at the state's largest newspaper. It contained a copy of my grandfather's geological survey for the site, a dozen of Mac's damming photos, and an anonymous tip to look into the foundation permits and inspection records for the Pinnacle Lofts. The response was immediate and devastating. The investors, spooked by the legal and financial ramifications, launched their own urgent internal review and hired a nationally recognized engineering firm to assess the situation. The newspaper story broke a week later with a front-page headline that sent shockwaves through the community: "Foundation of Blackwood's Pinnacle Lofts questioned by engineering experts." The city's Department of Buildings, facing a public firestorm, issued an immediate stop-work order and announced its own mandatory invasive inspection, which involved drilling core samples from the very foundation Ethan had built his empire upon. Ethan was trapped. He held a desperate press conference on the steps of the nearly completed building, his face a mask of false confidence. He called the allegations a baseless, malicious attack by disgruntled former employees, a thinly veiled reference to me. Then he made his final, fatal mistake. He looked right into the camera and said, "I stand by the integrity of this building, which was built with the most modern techniques. My uncle, Caleb Blackwood, is a man stuck in the past who doesn't understand modern engineering. This is nothing more than a personal vendetta." He tried to frame me. He tried to use my reputation for being old-fashioned as a shield for his own criminal negligence. The emergency meeting was called by the investors. It was held in a massive boardroom that felt like a courtroom. The air was thick with the stench of money burning. Ethan was there with a team of lawyers. I was there with Maggie and Dr. Thorne. The city's chief building inspector was there, along with the investors' own engineers. The inspector spoke first, his face grim. "The core samples confirm our fears," he said flatly. "The concrete mix is substandard, with a PSI rating nearly 30% below what was specified in the original plans. There are signs of significant voiding and multiple cold joints. The foundation does not meet the code requirements for this type of soil. It is, to be blunt, a failure." Ethan erupted, his voice shrill with panic. "This is sabotage. My uncle had access to the site plans. He could have tampered with the—" "Mr. Hayes," Dr. Thorne interrupted, his voice calm and academic, cutting through Ethan's hysteria. He stood up and, for the next 15 minutes, delivered a masterclass in structural engineering, using geological maps, stress modeling, and the city's own core sample data. He systematically, dispassionately dismantled Ethan's project, brick by fraudulent brick. He concluded, "This building is not just flawed, it is fundamentally unsafe. It is my professional opinion that it is unreparable and will require complete demolition." The room went silent. The lead investor, a man whose face had turned the color of ash, looked at Ethan, his voice a low growl. "You assured us. You signed personal guarantees of the structural integrity." "And that," Maggie said, her voice clear and sharp as breaking glass, "is the final nail in the coffin." She distributed a document to everyone at the table. When Mr. Hayes restructured the company, he took out a massive completion bond and a $20 million liability insurance policy for the project. However, the underwriters issued that policy based on the 100-year history and spotless record of Blackwood & Sons, a reputation built by Caleb Blackwood. The policy contains what's known as a legacy clause, which requires the direct oversight and final sign-off of a named principal with a proven track record, in this case, Caleb. Mr. Hayes removed his uncle from the project, fundamentally changed the approved building methods, and used inferior materials, all without notifying the underwriters. "We have a signed affidavit from the insurance company stating that this constitutes material misrepresentation and fraud. The policy is void. There is no insurance." The silence in the room was now absolute. Ethan was exposed. He hadn't just built a faulty building, he had built it on a mountain of fraud, leaving his investors holding the bag for hundreds of millions of dollars in losses: the land, the construction costs, the pre-sale liabilities. He was a captain who had not only sunk his ship but had also scuttled the lifeboats. His empire crumbled in a single afternoon. He was fired. The investors sued him personally for fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and gross mismanagement. He was forced into personal bankruptcy, losing everything: the fancy condo, the European sports car, the respect he so desperately craved. The Pinnacle Lofts, his monument to greed, stood empty for a year, a concrete skeleton against the sky, before a demolition crew brought it down in a controlled explosion, a spectacle that made the evening news. I didn't take the old company back. The name was tainted by Ethan's ambition. Instead, Mac and I, along with a dozen of the old loyal crew, started a new, smaller company, Blackwood Craftworks. We don't build condos. We build custom homes, restore historic barns, and take on community projects. We build things that last. My revenge was never about destroying Ethan. He did that to himself with his own greed and arrogance. It was about upholding a standard. He believed a legacy was just a brand name you could slap on a cheap product. I know that a legacy is a promise you keep, a foundation you pour correctly even when no one is watching. He tried to build his future on a lie. I built mine once again, on solid ground. And that is a foundation that can never be shaken.